We've heard that John Wesley was a preacher, but how did he actually speak and perform his sermons? That's the question I'm going to try to address in this video based on a document he wrote called Directions Concerning Pronunciation and Gesture. I'm going to use an actor, but we're not trying anything like historical reenactment. Rather, I'm going to use the actor to act out very particular aspects of John Wesley's speaking and preaching style that he discussed in this document, and also to have a discussion with me about John Wesley's preaching performance style. Despite the critical importance of preaching in early Methodism and the fact that George Whitefield's performance style has been studied in some depth by Harry Stout, there has never been, to my knowledge, a sustained study of how John Wesley actually performed his sermons. This has allowed interpreters of Wesley to write back into his age a number of anachronistic understandings of oratory and preaching performance style. John Wesley's Directions Concerning Pronunciation and Gesture, published in February 1749, gives us some substantial clues about how he performed his sermons. What I'm going to do in the following is to draw out from that document some of the clues it contains about John Wesley's style of preaching performance. The Directions Concerning Pronunciation and Gesture reveals the extent to which John Wesley's own practices of preaching reflected the highly developed oratorical performance culture of his day. The work was shamelessly, that is, without attribution, derived from a book by Michel Le Faucheur, originally published in 1657, that had been translated into English in 1727 as An Essay Upon the Action of an Orator as to His Pronunciation and Gesture done out of the French. Le Faucheur's work, in turn, utilized much of the wisdom of classical antiquity on rhetoric and speech, with long passages adapted from Cicero's De Oratore and other works, passages for which Le Faucheur himself did not give attribution. The work provides an excellent insight into commonly shared presuppositions about oratory and oratorical practices in the 17th and 18th centuries. That John Wesley utilized such performance techniques is illustrated from a comment by Horace Walpole, who remarked that Wesley appeared, quote, wondrously clean, but as evidently an actor as Garrick, referring to David Garrick, the best-known Shakespearean actor of the age. This quotation can be laid down beside a catena of quotations, most of which state that Wesley's preaching style was not flamboyant. One observer, in fact, described Wesley's preaching as, quote, chaste and solemn, close quotes. But oratorical performance did not have to be flamboyant in Wesley's age, and often took the form of solemn speech. Richard Heisenreiter has shown that Wesley's oral preaching, as revealed by third-party observers, was not significantly different from the substance of Wesley's preaching given in published sermons, with the exception of extended illustrations that appear in the oral sermons. In my view, this confirms that Wesley's oral style was not overly dramatic. And yet, the Directions Concerning Pronunciation and Gesture reveal how conscious Wesley was of elements of sermon performance. So I want to explore some of the specific aspects of Wesley's performance style that are revealed in the Directions Concerning Pronunciation and Gesture. The actor who appears in this is Russell Jonas, who was a Master of Fine Arts student here at SMU, and at the time when we made these video excerpts, was starring in the leading role of Richard in an SMU production of Shakespeare's Richard III. In what follows, then, I'm going to discuss a critical presupposition about John Wesley's preaching, namely his use of a periodic style of speaking, and Russell Jonas will illustrate the periodic style of speaking. Then Russell and I will discuss Wesley's ways of expressing emotion in preaching and his use of bodily movements, including gestures, in preaching. I will conclude by discussing the symphony of speech and emotion elicited by John Wesley's preaching performance. An absolutely critical presupposition of John Wesley's preaching performance was the periodic style of speaking. This means the division of speech into very distinct oral phrases that were called periods in classical rhetorical literature, with accented syllables at the end of a period. This was called a cadence, and with a noticeable pause called a caesura separating the phrases or periods. This practice seems to have been so obvious to John Wesley that he never even made a separate point of it, but referred to it at a number of points. Just to illustrate, by contrast, it is not the way I'm speaking right now. Just to illustrate, by contrast, it is the way I'm speaking right now. Got it? Before the development of amplified sound systems, and that was not until the early 20th century, this periodic form of speaking seems to have been almost universal. To project the voice in a public place required more breath than a person would use in ordinary conversation. Even if you spoke with a mechanical device like a megaphone, it still required deep breathing, and that meant pauses between phrases or periods. It required a big intake of breath, followed by a single phrase that could be delivered within the space of that one breath. One of the ways we know about this periodic style of speaking is to listen to some of the earliest audio recordings from the very late 1800s and the early 1900s. In this period, prior to the development of electronic amplification, people who spoke into recording devices almost naturally went into the periodic style of speaking that they would have used in public speech. Here, for example, is a 1919 recording of Thomas Edison, and you will hear that Edison speaks with brief pauses between periods or phrases.
Our boys made good in France. The word American has a new meaning in Europe. Our soldiers have made it mean courage, generosity, self-restraint, and modesty. We are proud of the North Americans who risked their lives for the liberty of the world. But we must not forget, and we must not permit demagogues to belittle the part played by our gallant allies.
Here's another example, in this case the founder of the Salvation Army, General William Booth, speaking in 1910.
I am glad you are enjoying yourselves. The Salvation is the friend of happiness. Making heaven on earth is our business. Serve the Lord with gladness is one of our favorite mottos. So I am pleased that you are pleased. But amidst all your joys, don't forget the sons and daughters of misery.
This periodic style of speaking came to characterize African American preaching, which often utilized more extended caesurae in which members of a congregation could respond. The periodic style, in this case, seems to have meshed seamlessly with the African cultural tradition of call and response. Here's a recording of Reverend C.L. Franklin, the father of soul music legend Aretha Franklin. This recording is from the 1950s, with Franklin speaking at the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit.
So, to Israel, we see in this vision, Babylon was a desolate place. Babylon represented a valley to Israel, a valley of depravity, a valley of disfranchisement, a valley of hopelessness, a valley of dry bones, a valley of lifelessness.
These audio recordings show how common the periodic style was and how common it has remained in some traditions of oratory. John Wesley's directions concerning pronunciation and gesture presuppose this method of periodic speaking at several points. For example, he wrote, "You should take care not to begin your periods either too high or too low. You may make a short pause after every period and begin the next generally a little lower than you concluded the last. Take care not to sink your voice too much at the conclusion of a period, but pronounce the very last words loud and distinct." Actor Russell Jonas illustrates the difference between a non-periodic and a periodic style of speaking as he performs some of the introductory sentences of John Wesley's sermon on salvation by faith. First, here's the non-periodic version, which also happens inadvertently to have an American accent.
All the blessings which God hath bestowed upon man are of his mere grace, bounty, or favor, his free undeserved favor, favor altogether undeserved, man having no claim to the least of his mercies. It was free grace that formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into him a living soul, and stamped on that soul the image of God, and put all things under his feet. The same free grace continues to us today, life and breath and all things. For there is nothing we are or have or do which can deserve the least thing at God's hands. All our works thou, O God, hast wrought in us.
Now, here's Russell Jonas's performance of those same sentences with a more periodic style and a British accent.
All the blessings which God hath bestowed upon man are of his free grace, bounty, or favor, his free undeserved favor, favor altogether undeserved, man having no claim to the least of his mercies. It was free grace that formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into him a living soul, and stamped on that soul the image of God, and put all things under his feet. The same free grace continues to us at this day, life and breath and all things. For there is nothing we are or have or do which can deserve the least thing at God's hand. All our works thou, O God, hast wrought in us.
Russell Jonas has a rich baritone voice. That's probably not how John Wesley himself actually sounded, since reporters stated that Wesley had a high-toned voice. But what Russell has illustrated in this second performance is that the oral period had a characteristic shape that had been described by Cicero and others. It began low and built up to a strong 1 or 2 beat cadence, that is, concluding emphasized syllables. The cadence was followed by the pause or caesura when the speaker could take a long breath. The use of repeated periods like this allowed speakers space to get the breath they needed for projecting their voices in a public setting. Caesurae gave a rhythmic quality to speaking and allowed sound to die down in an echoing or reverberating acoustical environment. Caesurae also gave hearers a little space to process phrases mentally before moving on to the next period or phrase.